I used to believe that knowing someone for a long time meant knowing them completely. Daniel Carter and I had been together for nearly 5 years, long enough for our lives to fold into each other seamlessly. We shared an apartment with neutral walls, a grocery list stuck to the fridge, and a rhythm that rarely surprised either of us. From the outside, it probably looked like love that had settled into maturity. From the inside, it felt like a quiet agreement to stop asking difficult questions. Daniel was dependable in ways that mattered on paper. He remembered bills, called his mother every Sunday, and kissed my forehead before leaving for work. I told myself those were signs of a solid relationship. Still, there were moments, small, almost unnoticeable, when I felt like I was speaking into a room that echoed back emptiness. Conversations ended quickly. Eye contact didn't linger. I learned to translate silence as peace, even when it felt more like avoidance that I rarely complained. I had learned early in life that wanting more could make you seem ungrateful. So I softened my expectations and adjusted my tone. When Daniel asked how my day was, I summarized instead of sharing. When I felt lonely beside him on the couch, I blamed myself for overthinking. Love, I told myself, wasn't supposed to feel dramatic. It was supposed to feel safe. That belief followed me into a small coffee shop one evening after work, where I met Lucas Bennett. The encounter was unremarkable at first, two strangers waiting in line, exchanging a polite comment about how long it was taking. Lucas had an easy way of smiling, not wide or rehearsed, but curious, as if he noticed people instead of scanning past them. We ended up sitting at the same narrow counter by the window, our drinks cooling between us as conversation slipped into place. Lucas asked questions the way people do when they genuinely want answers. Where I worked, what I liked to read, why I always ordered the same thing. I found myself responding without editing, surprised by how natural it felt. There was no flirting, nothing that crossed a line. Still, I was aware of the difference between being heard and merely being acknowledged. With Lucas, I felt present that I didn't tell Daniel about that first conversation. Not because it was a secret, but because it felt insignificant, or so I claimed. Yet the next time I saw Lucas, and the time after that, I noticed how easily those meetings found space in my routine. We talked about music, about cities we wanted to visit, about the quiet pressure of becoming someone others expect you to be. Lucas listened without interrupting, and when he spoke, it was with care, not certainty. At home, Daniel remained the same. Predictable. Kind in ways that no longer reached me. I watched him move through our shared space with confidence, as if nothing had shifted. And maybe nothing had, except me. I began to feel like a guest in my own relationship, careful not to disturb the balance we had worked so hard to maintain. The guilt arrived slowly. It wasn't sharp or accusing. It felt more like a question forming in the back of my mind. Why did I feel lighter after talking to Lucas? Why did silence with Daniel feel heavier than it used to? I avoided answering myself directly, choosing instead to focus on routines. Dinner at the same time. Shows we'd already watched. Plans we'd made out of habit, not excitement. One evening, Daniel fell asleep on the couch with the television still on. I sat beside him, listening to his steady breathing, and realized I couldn't remember the last time we had talked about anything that scared us. The realization wasn't dramatic, but it settled deep in my chest. Love hadn't left abruptly, it had thinned, stretched too far without being reinforced. As I turned off the lights and went to bed, my phone buzzed softly with a message from Lucas, nothing important, just a shared joke from earlier that day. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, aware that something subtle was shifting. I hadn't crossed a line, not technically. But for the first time, I wondered whether staying silent about what I felt was its own kind of betrayal. That night, lying beside Daniel in the dark, I understood that comfort could be misleading. It could convince you that stillness meant stability, and that wanting more meant risking everything. I closed my eyes, telling myself tomorrow would feel normal again. Yet somewhere between thought and sleep, a quiet truth surfaced: normal was no longer enough, and I wasn't sure how long I could pretend otherwise. What began as coincidence slowly reshaped itself into intention. I noticed it in the way I adjusted my schedule, how easily I justified an extra coffee break or a longer walk home. Lucas Bennett never asked for more of my time, which somehow made me give it freely. Our conversations had grown familiar, not because they were frequent, but because they were honest. With him, I didn't feel the need to polish my words or simplify my thoughts. Lucas had a way of pausing before he spoke, as if he respected the weight of what he was about to say. That patience unsettled me. I wasn't used to being listened to without urgency or expectation. I told myself this connection was harmless, that emotional ease didn't equal betrayal. Still, I avoided mentioning him to Daniel Carter, and that omission began to feel deliberate. At home, Daniel and I continued our routines with practiced efficiency. We ate together, slept beside each other, and discussed plans that existed comfortably in the future. Yet something essential was missing. I noticed how Daniel spoke at me rather than with me, how our conversations skimmed the surface of our lives. When I tried to dig deeper, he redirected gently, unknowingly reinforcing the distance between us. One evening, Lucas and I sat across from each other in the same coffee shop where we had first met. Outside, the city moved without concern, people passing by unaware of the quiet shift happening inside me. We talked about expectations, those imposed by family, by society, by ourselves. Lucas admitted he had once stayed in a relationship long after it stopped feeling true, simply because leaving felt cruel. His honesty stirred something uncomfortable in me. I recognized myself in his words more than I wanted to admit. Without thinking, I confessed that I sometimes felt invisible in my own life. Lucas didn't rush to respond. He studied my face, not intensely, but thoughtfully, as if deciding whether the next thing he said would matter. That was when he asked the question. If nothing had to change, Lucas said carefully, if no one would get hurt, would you still choose him? The air between us tightened. The question wasn't loud or dramatic, but it landed with a force I couldn't ignore. My first instinct was to defend Daniel, to list reasons that made staying logical and safe. But Lucas hadn't asked for logic. He had asked about choice. About desire that I didn't answer right away. In the silence that followed, I realized how rarely I allowed myself to sit with questions that threatened my sense of stability. I had built my life around avoiding discomfort, mistaking it for peace. Lucas's question peeled that illusion apart with unsettling precision. Later that night, lying next to Daniel, the question replayed in my mind. He was asleep, turned slightly away from me, unaware of the storm unfolding inches from his shoulder. I watched him breathe, remembering all the reasons I had chosen him once, his kindness, his steadiness, the future we planned together. Yet none of those memories answered the question Lucas had asked. The next day, Daniel talked excitedly about a vacation he wanted us to take. I nodded and smiled, participating in a conversation that felt increasingly foreign. I realized I was listening the way someone listens to a familiar song they no longer love, recognizing every note, feeling nothing new. The guilt sharpened then, no longer vague or distant. I wasn't betraying Daniel through action, but through absence. Through the truth I hadn't shared that I met Lucas again briefly, only to return a book he'd lent me. There was no lingering conversation, no dramatic moment. Yet as we stood there, I understood that the question had already changed everything. Lucas didn't need my answer spoken aloud. The conflict lived in my silence, in the way my life now felt divided between comfort and honesty. As I walked away, I knew I was standing at the edge of something irreversible. The question had exposed a truth I could no longer ignore. Staying without choosing was its own form of betrayal. And soon, I would have to decide whether I was brave enough to face the consequences of wanting more. I didn't arrive at honesty in a moment of courage. It came to me gradually, through exhaustion. Carrying two versions of myself, one that stayed quiet and one that questioned everything, had begun to feel unbearable. The question Lucas Bennett asked followed me everywhere, not as an accusation, but as an invitation I could no longer refuse. One evening, I asked Daniel Carter if we could talk. He looked surprised, not alarmed, which somehow made it harder. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table where we had once planned trips and celebrated small victories. The room felt too familiar, heavy with memories that no longer fit the present that I told him the truth without dramatics. I said I felt distant. I said I had been afraid to admit how lonely I'd become. I didn't mention Lucas at first, not because I wanted to hide him, but because I needed Daniel to understand that this wasn't about another person. It was about me realizing how long I had been living without honesty. Daniel listened quietly, his hands folded in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but strained. He admitted he had sensed the distance but believed it was temporary, something routine would eventually fix. Hearing that hurt more than anger would have. We had both mistaken endurance for effort. When I told him there was someone who had made me question what I wanted, I watched the realization settle in his eyes. There was pain there, but also clarity. Daniel didn't raise his voice or accuse me of betrayal. Instead, he asked the question I had been avoiding myself, why I hadn't spoken sooner. I didn't have a good answer, only the truth that fear had seemed easier than change, that we decided not to pretend anymore. There were no promises about the future, only an agreement to stop living in denial. That night, Daniel slept in the spare room. The apartment felt larger and emptier, as if it were acknowledging the space we had finally named. Days passed before I saw Lucas again. When we met, it was brief and deliberate. I told him I had spoken to Daniel, that I needed time to understand who I was without leaning on comfort. Lucas didn't reach for me or offer reassurance. He simply nodded, respecting the weight of the moment. Whatever connection existed between us didn't need urgency to feel real. Walking home alone, I noticed how different the city felt when I wasn't rushing to escape my thoughts. For the first time in a long while, uncertainty didn't feel like a threat. It felt honest. I understood then that infidelity wasn't defined solely by actions, but by avoidance, by staying silent when truth demanded a voice. That I returned to the apartment to find Daniel packing a few things, moving calmly, deliberately. We exchanged a quiet look that held more understanding than any argument could have. This wasn't an ending built on betrayal, but on recognition. Love hadn't failed us, fear had limited us. That night, I lay awake alone, aware of the loss and the possibility coexisting within me. I didn't know what would happen with Lucas, or whether I would ever rebuild something with Daniel. What I did know was this: I had finally chosen to listen to my heart, not because it promised happiness, but because it demanded honesty. And as sleep slowly found me, I understood that the most shocking question wasn't the one Lucas had asked, it was the one I was finally brave enough to answer. The apartment changed once Daniel Carter moved his things out. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in subtle ways that caught me off guard. A drawer left empty. A mug no longer drying by the sink. The silence wasn't hostile, it was observant, as if the space itself was waiting to see who I would become now that I was alone in it. That I kept replaying my last conversation with Daniel, not to punish myself, but to understand it. There had been no cruelty in his words, only disappointment shaped by restraint. I respected that more than anger. It reminded me that what we shared had been real, even if it had outgrown its truth. That realization didn't ease the ache, but it grounded it. Days passed without urgency. I went to work, returned home, cooked for one. Without Daniel's presence, I became acutely aware of my own habits, how often I avoided my thoughts, how easily I reached for distraction. Yet this time, I didn't turn away. I let the discomfort settle, believing it deserved my attention. When Lucas Bennett reached out, I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I needed to know whether I was responding out of clarity or escape. Eventually, we met for a quiet walk, choosing movement over conversation-heavy spaces. The city felt less imposing when we didn't sit across from each other, when silence could stretch without pressure. Lucas didn't ask what came next. He didn't need to. He spoke instead about his own boundaries, about learning to wait without expectation. That patience, once again, unsettled me, in a way that felt honest rather than tempting. I told him I wasn't ready to define anything, that I was still learning how to stand without leaning on someone else's certainty. He accepted that without disappointment. Walking home afterward, I realized something unexpected: the absence of guarantees didn't frighten me anymore. For years, I had mistaken clarity for commitment, believing that love needed to be named quickly to be real. Now, I understood that some truths need time, not labels. Daniel and I spoke once more, briefly, to close the practical details we had avoided. The conversation was calm, respectful, almost tender. We thanked each other, not for the ending, but for the years that shaped us. When we said goodbye, it felt complete. Not healed, but honest. That night, I stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the dark. I thought about the version of myself who believed staying silent was a form of loyalty. I understood now how wrong that had been. Silence hadn't protected anyone, it had only delayed the inevitable that I didn't know what the future held, with Lucas, or with anyone else. But for the first time, uncertainty didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like space. Space to grow, to choose, to speak before distance turned into betrayal. As I turned away from the window and into the quiet of my own life, one truth remained steady: love, in any form, could not survive without honesty. And whatever came next, I would no longer ignore the questions my heart had learned to ask.